Well, let's learn about seedless vascular plants, most of which, many of which at least, are ferns. Most of which, many of which at least, are ferns. And also horsetails / scouring rush that don't look like ferns, but they are. And a whole other phylum that are called Lycophytes. It includes club mosses, which aren't mosses, spike mosses, which aren't mosses, and quillworts, which aren't worts. What are worts? Refresh our memory. The plant life cycle. Remember that there are two stages in the plant life cycle. The diploid sporophyte, which produces spores by meiosis, which develop by mitosis into a separate stage in the life cycle called the gametophyte, which makes eggs and sperm that fuse together to form a diploid stage called the sporophyte. Let's refresh our memory further about mosses so we can compare them to seedless vascular plants. Mosses as a typical bryophyte. The dominant stage in the life cycle for mosses is the gametophyte, the leafy thing that you would point to and say there's a moss, or there's a liverwort, or there's a hornwort. And the sporophyte, when it develops, is permanently attached to the maternal gametophyte. So the two stages in the life cycle are shown here. Here, I'm drawing a circle around it. And the dominant stage in the life cycle is the gametophyte, and the sporophyte is not independent, but it's attached to the gametophyte. That's true for bryophytes. Ferns, as we will see, and as we already have seen, but we're refreshing our memory because we're going to look closer, have separate sporophytes. And the sporophyte's the dominant stage in the life cycle. Here again it's a moss, a picture of a moss. Down below we see the gametophyte, and above are the sporophytes. The dominant stage, the conspicuous stage, is the gametophyte, and the sporophyte is not separate, it's attached. So phylogeny, what we're looking at, again, two phyla of plants, the pterophytes, which includes ferns, and also includes, in our area, horsetails, and other parts of the world, what are called whisk ferns, and another phylum called Lycophytes, that includes club mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts, all three of which occur in Ohio. Here's a list of the plants of Ohio, including, that is to say, the seedless vascular plants, of which 64 are basically ferns that are leafy ferns. I'm going to say pteridophyte. Horsetails are actually ferns, and there are 6 of them. And there are 18 what are called lycophytes, club mosses, spike mosses, or quillworts. And they have some funny names. Spleenwort, that's a funny name. We have a whole bunch of different ferns in different genera. And we have these plants that are called adder's tongue because they kind of look like a snake's tongue. Grape fern because their clusters of Sporangia kind of look like grapes. And we have the ferns that are horsetails, then tubular plants with ridged stems, about which more later, in the genus Equisetum. And we have the lycophytes, which include quillworts, aquatic plants mostly, that look like onions, but they're not, club mosses, and a little group down at the bottom here that are called spike mosses. They kind of look like club mosses. We'll see a principal difference between them is that the club mosses are homosporous, producing one type of spore, and the spike mosses are heterosporous, or heterosporous, producing 2 types of spores, about which more later. So let's take a look at ferns, refresh our memory on ferns. And ferns, the gametophytes are small and inconspicuous. The sporophyte is the dominant stage of the life cycle. Sporangia, and in the case of all the plants except for the bryophytes, whose sporophytes only have one sporangium, ferns and other seedless vascular plants, their sporophytes produce many spore cases, many sporangia, and they develop on the underside of the leaves of the sporophyte. Sometimes it's obvious, and sometimes the leaves are so modified that you wouldn't make that distinction. And that's where meiosis takes place to produce spores. So here's the fern life cycle that we've seen. Here is the big leafy sporophyte. Down here is the little gametophyte, which is kind of basically about the size of a thumbnail. We'll see some pictures. The sporangia are really small. They're hand lens microscopic. They're not like high power microscopic. I can't think of anything to compare their size to, but they're small. I'll show you some pictures. And they split open to release spores. And this stage of the life cycle, which is a young sporophyte, sort of attached to an old gametophyte, looks kind of like a bryophyte. See, the sporophyte is attached to the gametophyte. But the sporophyte gets really, really big, and the gametophyte withers away. So this little resemblance to a bryophyte configuration, where a sporophyte is attached to a gametophyte, that's sort of temporary. The dominant stage is the sporophyte. So here's that diagram elegantly labeled. And again, we see a diploid sporophyte producing spores by meiosis, and they germinate to form a gametophyte, which in this instance, and in many instances, is bisexual / hermaphroditic. It has both male gametangia and antheridium and female gametangia, archegonium. And that condition, by the way, which we'll point out more explicitly later, but now's a good time, is called being homosporous. These spores are all the same, and they produce gametophytes that are bisexual. There's no separate male and female gametophytes in many ferns and many lycophytes, but no seed plants. They have different types of spores that produce male and female gametophytes. So this is the fern life cycle that we already have some familiarity with. Let's look at some pictures.